What's going on, guys? It's me, Zach, with another fantasy football video here. So in this one, I'm going to go over my general strategy going into a draft. If I know I've got a top three pick. For most of this, I'm assuming that you're playing in a 12-team league, but most of the same principles apply regardless of the number of teams. And if there are any differences, I'll be sure to sort of explain how a smaller or larger league would differ, how I'd approach that. Um, Really been enjoying making these videos for you guys. We've been doing a pretty good job keeping up with that 3 a week schedule. It's just football's right around the corner. We're recording this Sunday, August 7th, so we are 5 Sundays away from the opening week. So that's really exciting. I'm sure a lot of you guys have your drafts coming up, and really want to be here to help you guys do as well as you can. So if you do guys have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. I love interacting with you guys. Do my best to get back to all of you. So far, I've been able to do that, and hopefully, I can continue doing that. If you're new here, please do give me a feel free to subscribe. Click the bell for notifications. We do put out videos Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Um, and if you get anything out of this video, please feel free to give it a like, share it with anybody else you think it might help. Really trying to grow the channel as we can. We're at, I want to say the last time I checked, it was 82 subscribers, and I want to get to 100 by the start of the season. So um, we've done really well the last few days. I think we can get there, but it's just going to take a nice push. So thank you guys very much, and with that, let's get into the video. So the first thing I want to recommend to any of you guys that end up with a top three pick in your drafts is to prioritize running backs in the first 2 rounds. When you're given the benefit of a top three pick, you're one of the few lucky people that can guarantee you have an elite running back one, because there are less and less of those. So the NFL seems to shift towards more of a running back by committee approach and not really wanting to give anybody bell cow work. So I think that what you will see is that in most drafts, the ADP would suggest that the first picks are Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, and then Cooper Kupp. Um, Even if you have pick three, I would recommend avoiding Cooper Kupp in general. I think Cooper Kupp's going to be absolutely awesome. And obviously, if you took Kupp first overall last year, it worked out great for you. But I think that there's just so many great wide receiver values later on in the draft that you're not going to be able to find at the running back position. So getting an elite performer at the running back position is just too valuable. At pick three in all my drafts, I've been finding myself taking Austin Eckler. There are plenty of other running backs you could take at pick three. I know a lot of you guys are still high on Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook. I personally would rank the top three picks: Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler. So whichever one of those three is available for me at pick three is the one I end up taking. Um, and just for the reasons I mentioned, when we get into the later rounds, I'll explain why. There's just so many receivers I love in those rounds, and there's even great receivers late, and you're just not going to find running backs outside of really the top 3 rounds that I think you can rely on. And I don't want to find myself in a spot where um, I'm behind the 8 ball at running back despite having a top three pick. Not to mention, I think that there's not really much of a drop off between Cooper Kupp, Jamar Chase, and Justin Jefferson. In fact, I personally have Justin Jefferson as my wide receiver one this season. So I think that taking a receiver, especially Cooper Kupp at pick three, um, really puts you at a disadvantage compared to the players drafting at the 4 or 5 spot, because they're still getting one of those receivers, maybe even the 6 spot if somebody does take Eckler, and then they're getting a better pick than you in round two. So you're starting off behind the 8 ball there, and it's just it's hard to come back from that. And I think that the safest thing you can do is just make sure you're locked in at running back. Um, Moving into round two, the running backs I've been absolutely loving taking those picks 18 to 24 are Aaron Jones, Alvin Kamara, and Nick Chubb. Probably in that order. Aaron Jones seems to be pretty consistently there towards the tail end of round two, and I think he's absolutely going to exceed that ADP. I personally have him as a top 10 running back this season. Um, there's just going to be so much passing volume for him and enough work on the ground that it won't shock me if he puts up 1,500 total yards and 15 touchdowns again. Alvin Kamara is another great option. He's obviously got top three running back upside, and people are just worried about the suspension stuff. Seems more and more likely that that suspension gets pushed towards 2023, so I think Kamara's ADP will rise. So you might see him sort of start getting drafted above this tier. But for as long as he's here, I love taking him. Um, you're giving yourself a legitimate shot at 2 top 3 running backs if you follow this strategy. And the last running back you can get sort of at the end of those second round really consistently is Nick Chubb. Obviously, all of this depends on the platform you play on and your own specific league, but Nick Chubb is finding himself going towards like the middle of round 3, and I think he's going to rush for 1,500 yards and 15 touchdowns this season probably. The Browns have a really nice, easy schedule to start the season, so even if Watson's suspended, I think they're going to have no problem controlling games, and there are even rumors of Kareem Hunt wanting to be traded. So if that happened, obviously Nick Chubb gets even more valuable. So I love both of those, all 3 of those running backs. I think that if you can get those 2, you're really set, and it gives you the luxury of not having to look at the running back position later on in these drafts when we get into the receivers that I absolutely love. I will say that if for whatever reason Kelce slips to you at the end of round 2, it does seem relatively platform dependent, but on ESPN, Kelce does seem to be finding himself there pretty often, and I think many of you will play on ESPN. So if Kelce's available for you at the end of round 2, I have absolutely no problem taking him. And then I would just say that you should try to get one of those running backs in round 3. Like I said, on ESPN, which is where you're more likely to find Kelce. Nick Chubb might be there for you at the the early part of round 3. So that's an incredible start. If you could go Austin Eckler, Nick Chubb, Travis Kelce as your first 3 draft picks, I guess it'd be Eckler, Kelce, Chubb in that order. You're locking in 2 RB1s and probably the tight end one, and it's just going to be really hard for teams to compete with that throughout the course of the season. I spent some time trying to think about wide receivers that would really could realistically be there and would make me want to pick them at the end of round 2 over running backs like that, and there really weren't. I suppose there is a world that exists where all 3 of those running backs are gone, and then you're forced to take a receiver. So then I guess at that point, take the one you want. But I think it's going to be really hard for all 3 of those guys to be gone. There not be another running back like Javonte or DeAndre Swift, who I still wouldn't take over, who I would still take over receivers like Mike Evans and T. Higgins. And those are the receivers you're picking at the top of round 3 and the end of round 2. If for whatever reason CeeDee Lamb or Stephon Diggs somehow slipped you at the end of round 2, then I'd be more open to taking those players, but we're more often seeing those players at the beginning and middle of round 2. So it's hard to get those guys with your second pick when you have one of these early picks. So I think in 90% of your draft scenarios, it just makes sense to take 2 running backs to start, and then you'll be able to really get the value at the receiver position that I'll talk about later. Moving on to rounds 3 to 5, I think in general here, I'm assuming that you started out with the running back selections, sort of like I talked about previously. And at this point in the draft, you should have one of, if not the best running back duos in your league. But obviously you're behind at wide receiver and you're behind at tight end if somebody took Kelce. So in round 3, that's where I find myself taking Mark Andrews if he's there. Otherwise, I find myself looking for players like CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, sometimes T. Higgins, depending on the format, but assuming you play in PPR formats, I'd take Keenan Allen there. In general, yeah, I'm just looking to get the best wide receiver available in round 3. I was just using those players as examples. There's guys who I've been taking, but obviously, if you guys have different preferences, feel free to use your own rankings. This is just sort of the roster construction examples I'm giving you, but many of you might love Tyreek Hill or Debo, or maybe you really love Pittman and you're playing in a format where he shows early. So take your guy there. I'm just using those player names as examples, so don't necessarily at this certain point start focusing too much on the names I'm using. In round 4 though, this would be the tail end of round 4. You'd be picking from picks about 46 to 48. This is where I'm on board with taking Waller. Obviously, if you took Mark Andrews, you're not taking Waller. Don't take 2 tight ends early like that, because you're going to put yourself in a really real hole. And in general, a low-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 3, I guess, is on par with a top 5 tight end outside of the top 2 every year. So playing a tight end in the flex doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, assuming you take no tight ends, I am absolutely loving just taking two wide receivers at the 4 or 5 turn. I listed some names here, pretty much in order of my fondness for them, but I've been absolutely loving leaving drafts with Mike Williams, Cortland Sutton, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Those are the three that I end up with the most, but I love the other guys I mentioned there. Obviously, a caveat would be if you took Keenan Allen, maybe you knock Mike Williams down in your rankings some there. But once again, these are all receivers that I've shown here that I think have legitimate wide receiver 1 upside. And I don't think there are many running backs you get in these rounds that have that upside. When you get into these rounds, you start drafting running backs ranging from Ezekiel Elliott to Josh Jacobs. Is about the range you're drafting in. And outside of maybe Travis Etienne, I don't think there's any of the running backs in this range that I think have a legitimate shot at that top tier running back upside. And Etienne comes with too many question marks for me to be really wanting to miss out on the opportunities I see at all these receiver positions, especially if you find yourself in the luxurious position of having these two really elite running backs already. So I think that it makes a lot of sense just to hammer wide receiver as much as you can, because the way you started out your draft going running back, you're in a way screwed if those two don't pan out. Obviously, you're never screwed if one gets hurt and it's not all season or whatever. You can find a way to fight through it. But when you draft those two early on, you're deciding and committing to those two being the anchors of your roster. So it doesn't really make sense to me to then draft another player in the first 5 rounds that only really matters for you if one of your top 2 doesn't work out, because then you're already behind the 8 ball and you're going to have a hard time winning your league. So after round 5, obviously your draft position starts to matter a lot less, because you're all pretty much picking from the same pool of players at this point. ADP starts to matter a lot less because you start to see a lot more disparity in terms of where players are going. But in these 4 rounds, it's absolutely when I love to be drafting my quarterbacks. But I think that there are enough quarterbacks here that there are very few quarterbacks that I would necessarily advise reaching for. But I will say you absolutely need to leave round 9 with your quarterback, because then you get into the Kirk Cousinses and the Derek Carrs and the Matthew Staffords of the world, and those are the players that I think they leave you susceptible to the possibility of being a tier lower than everybody else in your league at the quarterback position. And especially if you play in a 6-point passing touchdown league, or even a slightly larger league than 12 teams, it gets really hard if you don't have one of those top tier quarterbacks. Not top tier, but if you don't have a top 12 quarterback, it gets very difficult. And if you wait too long, you will find teams that start taking 2. In general, in round 6 is where I'm looking to get Jalen Hurts or Kyler Murray. Round 7 is where I end up drafting Russ or Dak. Again, those are just names that I'm personally using. I don't want you to necessarily just go with those players because I'm recommending them. I want you to basically use this as a template for how you should build out your roster. And if you want to insert different names into those rounds, you're more than welcome to. This is just how I generally approach building my teams during the draft. I will also say that in rounds 6 to 9, if you haven't drafted a tight end yet, just wait on it. This is generally a bit of a tight end dead zone where you draft a tight end that's projected to be tight end 10, and he finishes as tight end 10, and he's hardly better than if you just stream tight end the whole season. So in general, I find it a lot more effective that if you miss out on that top 5 tight ends, for me, I'd personally say the cutoff is probably Dalton Schultz. So once Dalton Schultz is off the board, just don't take a tight end until towards the end of your draft, and take 2. And hope you hit on one of your dart throws. I've talked about some tight ends I like already. I love taking Gerald Everett, Irv Smith, Cole Kmet, players like that at the end of the draft, and just seeing what happens. This is also the portion of the draft where I do look to add a couple more running backs. There are a lot of values I like here. In round 6 to 9, I've loved drafting players like Chase Edmonds, A.J. Dillon, Kareem Hunt, Tony Pollard, among others, but these are the guys I tend to find myself leaving drafts with. I've talked about all of them, I believe, in separate videos, except for Kareem Hunt, I believe. And I did touch on how Kareem Hunt might be traded, so he's, to me, still not a risk at all, because if he's traded, he'll be traded to a team that plans to use him. But that was a bit of a side note. Regardless, these are the rounds where you stop. The opportunity cost of drafting running back starts being low enough that it's okay to build out on that depth, because obviously you're going to need more than 2 running backs during the course of your season. But I would still look for value at the receiver position as well here. And yeah, I think that about covers that. So after, aside from just the general roster construction, there's a couple other notes I wanted to sort of talk about in terms of how you should just go into your draft with the mindset of when you have one of these earlier picks. So first off, when you have a top 3 pick, the same thing will apply to a late pick. So in a 12-team league, if you have a pick from 10 to 12, it means the ADP becomes a little bit less relevant for you. And that I mean it's harder for you to play the ADP game of hoping that a player slips to you to your next draft pick, because there's going to be so many picks between each of your selections. And that also means you might have to find yourself reaching a little bit more. I know I mentioned, for example, that in round 3 is when I start taking a receiver. And if you think that Keenan Allen, whose ADP is the 32nd player off the board, and you're picking with the 25th pick, if he's the best receiver on the board for you, you should take him there, because he's not coming back, and you've already decided you want to get a receiver there. The other thing I want to touch on that I didn't mention is that if a quarterback value in the first 5 rounds on a player like Josh Allen or Herbert presents itself, and you do want to pull that trigger, it's not normally what I would do, because like I talked about, there are a lot of really good quarterbacks I like getting later in the drafts, around 6 to 9, but if you do, say Herbert goes into the 5th round, or Josh Allen falls to the 4th, maybe even late 3rd is when I'd look at it, you're more than welcome to do that, but I would absolutely say that you should not take those players if you took a tight end in the top 5 rounds as well. If you take a quarterback in the first 5 rounds or a tight end in the first 5 rounds, you're going to be behind the 8 ball at either running back or tight end by the end of round 5. And if you take both, you're going to be behind both of those positions, and it's just going to be really hard for you to build out a complete roster. So that's just too much risk that I want to take on. But yeah, with that, that'll be all. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.